and we're expecting one more person uh,
Okay.
to join us, and I trust that he'll be able to make it. Okay, so let me hit my usual cue in music, and then we'll get going. So here we go.
Okay.
The Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium presents Transforming Guyana. In each episode, Dr. Blackman and Dr. Lewis will tackle a different area of interest for transforming Guyana.
Well, welcome to the broadcast. Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 4 of the Transforming Guyana webinar, hosted by the Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium. As usual, I'm your host, Terrence Blackman, Chair, Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar College and the founder of the Guyana Business Journal. Today, my usual co-host, Dr. David Lewis of the Caribbean Policy Consortium of Manchester Trade, is on travel duty, and so I'm flying solo in today's webinar. In our background chats, I was saying that this webinar has its roots all the way back in a visit to the Wales sugar estate in about 2016 or 17, and so we want to explore, in some sense, what a Guyanese Universal Basic Income scheme might look like in this new era of oil and gas. And a question that always that of the Guyana Business Journal is that we're simply dedicated to catalyzing a stronger, a more inclusive, prosperous Guyana by, in a sense, championing some equitable opportunities aimed at kind of fostering a thriving democracy and broadly advocating for a fair distribution of economic growth. And so as part of that sort of aim, we want to catalyze the conversation between experts. We want to amplify diverse perspectives, all leading to charting a sustainable path forward for Guyana and ensuring that all citizens benefit from the nation's growth, particularly in context of this evolving energy sector. And so today, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Michael Lewis, distinguished faculty member at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College in CUNY. He specializes in public policy analysis with a focus on the universal basic income schemes and its potential to address social and economic inequalities. Professor Lewis's research explores economic and ethical dimensions of UBI, draws on empirical data and policy stimulations, and he is known for his in-depth study of how UBI can be a transformative tool for promoting social justice and economic security. And I should add, when I looking for experts in this, I decided, obviously, as the first choice to look for experts within my own city, University of New York. And to my pleasant surprise, up popped the name Professor Michael Lewis. And I said, I know this guy. We were in graduate school together. So welcome, Professor Lewis. We're expected to be joined by Professor Clive Thomas, distinguished Guyanese economist, academic, advocate for economic justice, with decades of experience in developmental economics. And in a sense, he is the architect of the Buxton proposal, which calls for using Guyana's oil revenues to deliver direct cash transfers to households with the goal of reducing poverty and promoting equitable growth. And many of you know that Professor Thomas is celebrated for his commitment to social and economic transformation in Guyana. and he served as an advisor to governments and international organizations for his impactful work on addressing inequality and empowering marginalized communities. And then my last guest, and this is actually quite beautiful because I'd written to him some time ago because, as many of you know, Dr. Troy Thomas, a lecturer at the University of Guyana, known for his work on sustainability, advocacy for good governance and transparency in Guyana. He's contributed significantly to the academic and public discussions on sustainable development and held various leadership roles, dean at the University of Guyana and a former president of the Transparency Institute of Guyana. And, his work broadly sort of focuses on ethical governance in the context of Guyana's developmental challenges. So I want to welcome you colleagues to our program and to take advantage of your expertise here. I want to just share a few slides just to cue things up, and having queued it up, I'll switch it to you. So, the broad subject of the discussion is the universal basic income, and perhaps I should have let Michael do this in sense of defining a UBI. Actually, I will let you do this. I will simply just cue to the end of my slides, which I sort of wanted to have some questions, for what a Guyanese UBI scheme might look like. And so I thought, one, how will you fund the UBI sustainably, right? So ensuring that the funding is stable, transparent, and not overly dependent on the volatility in the oil markets. What are the potential economics of some of my colleagues have often said these things are inflationary and they will drive down employment. Folks are not going to want to work anymore. And so what are the potential economic impacts on inflation and employment? And then the obvious question, who will be eligible? How do you determine eligibility for this kind of thing? What is sort of the schemes around? I won't say some of the questions that I received on this front because it might muck the debate up. So, should the payments be universal or should they be targeted? What's the sort of efficient way to distribute? How should UBI interact with existing social programs? Should it replace? Should it complicate? Does it complicate the existing schemes that are already there? And what sort of governance structures are needed to manage the UBI? How do we, what's been the sort of logic of how you establish checks and balances to sort of ensure the transparency, and something that Troy has talked about in some of his work about the public trust of these things, and then what does it look like in the long run? What are sort of what are some examples of the long-term socioeconomic impacts of implementing a UBI scheme, and how well has it worked to kind of align with the objectives like poverty reduction, income inequality, and more broadly economic resilience? And so perhaps using that as a frame, I want you now, Michael, to kind of walk us through. I know that you've done this thing, and so I'll be your guide in this. So remember, so the one thought I will say is that when this discussion sort of emerged in the Guyanese context, there was a huge kind of moral thing, a moral sort of saying, well, you can't just give people free money. And it was not based in, and it was not an economic argument, but it was more like a moral argument. Somehow, the give a man a fish or teach a man to fish type thing. And I've always wanted to kind of have a more rational, fact-based, literature-based discussion about, what are the options for us in this context. And so I'll come to you, Michael, and give it, help us to understand this business of the universal basic income.
Okay. Thank you, Terrence. Nice meeting you, Troy. Hello to the audience. I am at a slight disadvantage here because I think everyone else here knows much more about Guyana than I do.
So that's actually an
Okay.
opportunity. Yeah,
Okay.
that's
Um,
exactly why, that's exactly why I tried to not have people who are from Guyana, because it makes it more objective.
okay. Um, so I'm going to put that out there. That's just the way it is. But I do know a bit about the basic income. And I'm going to do a little bit of a talk, and I think I'll answer some of the questions that Terrence posed. We didn't really plan this, but it just so happened that I think I'll address some of those questions. And then others I don't address, maybe we can get to during the discussion. So, as Terrence said, I am going to start with the definition of a UBI. And that helps me in two ways. One, it just explains the idea to people who may not be as familiar with the topic as other people are. So it just gives us some sense of what we're talking about. But also it helps me answer some of the questions Terrence posed, because I can then talk about how it relates to the rest of the social welfare system by going over the definition. At least I can do some of that. So as far as what a basic income is, some people say universal basic income, some just say basic income. I use those interchangeably. Some say UBI for universal basic income. But the definition of a UBI that I usually draw upon, at least as a working definition, is one that is featured by an organization called the Basic Income Earth Network. That organization has been around, I think, since the early or mid 80s, so a long time now. It was initially the Basic Income European Network, but then around, I forgot, I think in the mid 2000s, early 2000s, when it became clear that the basic income discussion was going beyond, I guess it already had gone beyond Europe, but that became, I guess, clearer that it was really a discussion that was now worldwide. They chose to change the name to Basic Income Earth Network, and they have conferences. They used to have them every 2 years. Now they have them every year, and they've had them in different parts of the world. The most recent one was in Bath. I think some would say, who are from that part of the world might say Bath, right? BATH. But they've had them in, I think they've had them in Brazil. It'll be in Brazil again next year. They've had it in South Africa, South Korea. So they've gotten all over the world, the globe, a bit. But they define basic income in the following way. Now, website. They call it a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. Again, a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without a means test or work requirement. And what I want to do is talk about each part of this definition. And again, that will help me spell out to some extent how it relates to other parts of the social welfare system. And I'll do more of that later on as well. So the first thing to talk about is this notion of it being periodic. The idea here is that a UBI would be paid at regular intervals of some kind. So a one-time cash payment, as some people advocate, a one-time cash payment, a lump sum payment, we call it in economics, right? That would not be a basic income. We're talking about regular intervals, and what those intervals are can vary. It could be once a year, it could be once a month, it could be once every quarter of the year. But the idea is that there will be some regular interval upon which people will receive the UBI benefit. So that's one part of the definition. And that's similar to a number of social welfare benefits, um, and at least in the parts of the world that I know more about, the U.S. being the main part of the world, but other ones as well. They often have various kinds of cash benefits that people receive monthly, um, maybe in some cases, and in the U.S. usually monthly. The ones I'm thinking about, usually monthly. So this would be periodic in the same sense as other benefits typically or often are. So that's one part of the definition. Um, the second part is that I want to talk about is that it would be paid in cash. Now, when I say cash, I mean um, some form where there won't be restrictions on what can be purchased with the benefit. In the U.S. and maybe in Guyana as well. In the U.S., we have what are called in-kind benefits that are different from cash benefits. An example would be what some call the food stamp program, but I think the official name is Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP, they call it for short. And this is a benefit that the actual form of the benefit is kind of it's kind of a card, like a credit card, kind of, but it's a card that one uses, and the card is, I guess, programmed such that they are restricted regarding what they can purchase with the benefit. So they can only purchase some kinds of food benefits, right? So it's kind of like a voucher for food. The U.S. also has vouchers for housing, and so these are benefits that really specify what they can be used to buy or purchase. Um, and a UBI would not be that. It would be cash, and again, cash just means it can be used. The benefit can be used in an unrestricted way. I mean, you could imagine people being given actual goods. I mean, so being given not a voucher for food, but actual food, right, or actual housing. But a UBI would not be that. It's a cash benefit, and so it allows people more autonomy regarding what to buy, what to purchase with the benefit. And some critics of UBI don't like that autonomy. Some supporters like that autonomy, and maybe we can talk about that during the discussion. The the third part of the definition is that the part that says delivered on an individual basis. So we're talking about the individual being the unit that receives the benefit, not the household. And that distinction again is related to a lot of what we do in the U.S. context around social welfare. A lot of the times we look at the household income, and if the benefit is means tested, meaning, which I'll get to the next point, the benefit is means tested, meaning it's based on one's income, and you have to be below a certain income to qualify. Often the household income is assessed because the benefit is being delivered to the household. Um, but the UBI proponents and the UBI definition looks at the idea of the individual being a beneficiary. So if there's a household of two adults, each adult will get their own check. If there's a household with adults of children, then typically children are not given benefits directly, but one adult might be given the benefit on the kid's behalf, right? But the benefit is targeting individuals, not households, although, of course, many individuals live as part of households. That we can also talk more about if people are interested. Why some people like that idea, why some do not. Um, Fourth, the part of the definition I want to talk about is it being universal. That's not actually in the definition universal, but that's implicit in it. And the idea here is that's why it's called UBI, because sometimes the U stands for unconditional. Typically, it stands for unconditional and universal. That's what the U typically stands for. So universal is the idea that it's paid to everyone. So it's not means tested. It's not targeted. And one of the questions Terrence raised was whether or not we should target and not do this universal benefit. So I'm sure we'll come back to that. But it's paid to all, not means tested. And again, means tested is the idea that, and the practice that in order to qualify for a benefit, your income and income or income plus assets must be below a certain level in order to be eligible. So universal basic income is not that, and it's not targeted based on people's race or whether or not they're pregnant or things like that. It's a universal benefit to all, at least in a gross sense. And I can say what I mean by that later on if you want me to. And the last part of the definition is the idea that it's unconditional. And this typically means there's no work requirement or no requirement to demonstrate one's willingness to work. And again, in Terrence's introduction, I think he said there are people he's talked to who don't like this aspect of a UBI. They don't think people should get something for nothing. They worry that this might lead to people not working as much. So we can talk about that later on as well. But the UBI definition is that we would give the benefit to people whether or not they work or demonstrate a willingness to work. So that's the definition. How am I doing on time? Am I okay?
You're doing good. You're doing
okay.
good.
Very good. So what I want to do now is and this will help me talk a bit more about how a basic income might fit into the social welfare system or systems that already exist a little bit, right? And the distinction that will help me talk about this, because that was also one of Terrence's questions, I think. So the distinction that will help me talk about this is one that's often made between income assistance. I mean, we talk there's the unifying, I guess, idea is cash assistance. So you give people cash, not in-kind benefits. But there's a distinction often made between cash assistance that's really meant to be a kind of income assistance, and cash assistance that's meant to be social insurance. So let me make that distinction and then talk about how UBI is more like income assistance than social insurance. So in a system like the US, we aren't as, I guess, our social welfare system isn't as generous as Finland's or Sweden's. Some would say, I think most would say that. They might disagree on whether they liked it or not, but we're not as generous as those countries are.
Well, there's some people watching all the way from Switzerland, and they
agree.
Well, they sort of agree.
Okay, maybe so. I would want to hear what they think. I mean, but from our way we look, I mean, we think that that the U.S. is not as generous as like some of the other sort of OECD countries we compare it to, right? But we have a social welfare system, and we do have some that look more like income assistance and some more like social insurance. So let me explain what I mean by that difference. And the way I think about it is kind of mathematically. So income assistance programs, you can think of them as providing people with income at regular intervals that is really attempting to make sure, let's say, their average monthly income, or their average income over some period doesn't fall below some threshold, right? So you really think of income assistance as trying to sort of keep the average income people receive at least at least some threshold, right? Now maybe the threshold they focus on is too low, some might say, but you focus really on the average income of people, right? And trying to keep that at some level. And so we have programs now in the U.S. to do that. There's a program that goes primarily to parents of young children. That's commonly called welfare. The real name is temporary assistance for needy families. But that's that kind of program, and there are other ones. I mean, food stamps, again, that's an in-kind benefit, not cash. But that's more like that. If you think of the in-kind benefit as cash for food, it's trying to sort of keep their average income at a certain level. Social insurance, on the other hand, the way I think about it is trying to address sort of unpredictable changes in the variance of income, right? The standard deviation of income. Like, so your income, you may lose a job and your income drops drastically, or like get sick and your income drops drastically. So think of this as really trying to address what you might call income volatility. So income assistance, average income, social insurance, income volatility that usually results from some kind of event, a lost job, a health issue, things like that. UBI is more like income assistance. So one of the questions Terrence asked was, how should a UBI fit in with the current social welfare system? I think one answer you might get is that we can think of UBI. If a country has a social welfare system and some benefits are more income assistance, as I'm describing it, more about the average income, you can think of a UBI as potentially replacing some of those benefits or all of those, because it may be a more efficient way of trying to address the income assistance, the income average problem. But if you have benefits like, in our case in the US, unemployment insurance, some would say old age insurance, right? I mean, we call it Social Security. Um, that's more about trying to sort of cushion people against the drastic income reduction that they experience upon retirement, right? That's why it's more like social insurance. So you may want to keep the social insurance systems in place, but use the UBI to replace some of, or maybe all of, depending on the context, the income assistance program. So that's one answer to that question you might get that Terrence asked. But we can talk more about that later on. I think I want to end a little bit on two things. Some of these, one area being why folks support the UBI, and then another area being potential challenges. And this gets at Terrence's questions about employment impacts, inflation, things like that. So there are several reasons people often give to support a UBI, and I'll just list them and say a little bit about each one, but I can say much more about all of them. One is this idea of freedom. A lot of people who support UBI like freedom and autonomy, and they think that one constraint on people's freedom and autonomy is the need to find someone to sell their labor to work for, right? They either need that or need to find someone who else has found someone who can do that for them. But people are relying on work a lot. And to the degree you rely on an employer hiring you to get access to the goods and services you need to survive, you are subject perhaps to the domination of employers because they rely on them to eat and remain housed. And given the fact that many of us work in organizations that are set up in such a way where the workers don't have much power, the employers do. The employers fire workers. Workers don't fire employers. Employers like set workers, vacation time. Workers don't set employers for vacation time. So we work in, some would say, relatively autocratic industries, and so we are really subject to the whims of employers. And having an income that's separate from a wage or salary might give workers more freedom to live their lives as they see fit. That's sort of one kind of argument. Another kind of, or no, one reason. Another reason people offer to provide a reason as a reason for supporting basic income is it can decrease the cost of providing unpaid care work. A lot of people, I think it's still true across the world, primarily women, I think. They provide a lot of unpaid care work to their family members, maybe to friends, to kids, to older relatives, older friends. And when they do that, in certain contexts, they can't work as easily outside the home to get. So I'm going to use work in two different ways. There's this unpaid work I'm talking about, and then work where you sell your labor, right? And so selling your labor often can't be done if you're doing full-time unpaid care work, and therefore you suffer the opportunity cost of losing a wage, right, from being able to work for a wage. And so a UBI can at least soften the blow from a loss of wage when you must provide unpaid care work. Unpaid care work, because in a sense you can think of it as subsidizing what economists call leisure. But leisure in this case is not very leisurely because you're taking care of kids and changing their diapers and things like that. Three, another reason for a UBI is automation, precarious labor. So automation, and that can be the idea of AI taking many jobs or some jobs, or AI making these jobs that still remain more precarious, insecure wages, work conditions. And so as AI makes the labor market more so-called precarious, people say, that could be a reason to suggest we need a UBI. And then a UBI could be a way of addressing poverty. But the extent to which, the degree to which it is able to do so would depend on the level of the UBI. A small UBI may not do much, a larger one might. But then that raises the question of how large a one can a society sustain. But a UBI at a certain level might address poverty to a large degree. Given how UBI, a lot of current social welfare policies have what we call poverty traps, meaning that if people try to get a wage job, a job that pays them a wage, they may lose benefits that they currently have. And once they pay taxes on the wages, the taxes they pay plus the loss of benefits sorry.
It puts them behind where they were to begin with. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right. That's the poverty trap. And so UBI often has fewer of those components, right, that create poverty traps. So some will say that's a way to address poverty because people can then combine work and a UBI more easily, right? We can talk more about that. Also, as far as poverty, a lot of people who qualify for certain programs who are poor enough to qualify, they choose not to because of stigma. And so if a UBI is structured universally, that may mean stigma is reduced because everyone gets it, but it has a disproportionate impact in a good sense on those who are more poor, right, than those who are rich. And so that may be a way to address poverty as well. And one thing I think Terrence asked about earlier, which I mentioned, why universal and not targeted. One reason people give for universalism, I just said, one is stigma. It may prevent that. And the other is once you decide to target benefits, you got to figure out whom to target. And once you start doing that, then you may actually end up missing people who should get the benefit, but they don't because they can't prove well enough that they are actually deserve the benefit, or you miss them, or things like that, right? So people fall through the cracks. The people who you're trying to target are more likely to fall through the cracks. Some people argue if you give benefits in a targeted way, than if you give benefits universally, because you're not trying to figure out who gets it, who doesn't, right? So that's the stuff on poverty. I'm going fast because I want to give other people the chance to talk. This is my last bit here, and I'll just lay these out, and we can talk about them later on. So potential challenges. One I've already said, really. The degree to which a UBI could address poverty depends on the UBI level. A very low UBI probably won't do much to address poverty. So can you get the UBI level high enough to address poverty, but still make the UBI sustainable given the potential impacts on labor supply, given how it's financed, given the way it's financed, the impacts of that on labor supply and all that stuff. I mean, that's a question that's open. I think that's a challenge, right? Well, those are challenges. Another challenge is, this is implied in what I just said. In economics, we talk about income effects, and that's where, if you get money that you don't have to sell your labor to receive, that all else equal will tend to result in you selling less labor, right? Because you'll so-called buy more leisure. In English, you may work less, sell your labor less. And so a UBI could lead to a reduction in labor supply. If that were to happen, I suspect employers would raise wages and try to get some people to come back, right? Or improve work conditions or something, but try to coax people back. So the net reduction may be smaller than we think if you just considered the impact of UBI alone, and didn't look at the employer demand response, labor demand response. But it could have an effect on labor supply. Something that's good, something that think that's bad. I'm sure that depends on how big a reduction it leads to. I mean, you can't have everyone leaving the job market. That wouldn't work as long as, I mean, until the robots do take over, you still need humans to sell their labor. A third challenge is inflation, right? One way that could happen is with what I just said. I mean, if employers raise wages enough to coax people back to the job market, depending on how large the reduction in labor supply was, and therefore how much they have to coax people back, and therefore how much to raise wages, that can lead to inflation through passing on the wages to price increases. So that's an issue. And then again, I suggest, it's my last point, how we fund a UBI could generate behavioral effects, which might threaten its viability. And what I mean by that is if you use certain taxes, and if those are in effect wage taxes, then it's a little bit more iffy, right? But it could be that wage taxes lead to a reduction in labor supply, right? Because people take home less from their earnings than before, or it might lead to an increase because they need to work more to maintain their standard of living. No one knows which one that would be, and so that's an empirical question. But in terms of economic theory, it's possible that funding the UBI in certain ways could generate behavioral effects that might affect its sustainability, its viability. That's my last point. Hope that didn't take too long.
No. That's exactly. I think that's exactly what I was hoping to kind of, in a way, be the contribution of the program, to have a sense of what these things mean, and I was hoping at this moment that Professor C.Y. Thomas would have joined us, but he's not here yet. So I'll let that go, and I'll come to Professor Troy Thomas. Michael sort of laid out this thing quite nicely for us. I won't forget it. It's periodic, it's cash, it's individual, it's unconditional and universal. And so from where you sit with the sort of Guyanese perspective, give a thought around how you see that intersecting, with the future, how you see that intersection with anything that you want to. There are questions that are coming, which are, to your earlier question, what is the current average monthly gross pay for a worker in Guyana? Is that something that we have an easy access to in terms of data? I'm noting here, someone notes for us that that this question of extreme poverty is so the World Bank data, it seems to suggest that 48% of the population is and sort of widening inequality. How do you tailor a UBI or otherwise to kind of address those issues? So I'll let you riff it, whatever.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And the discussion presentation so far have been enlightening, and I like the points raised. Some years ago, I might have been more in support of the more conditional cash grant type of arrangement. But over time, I think I also began to see some of the pitfalls with that, with the means testing and so forth, people falling through the cracks, people who have more individuals to vouch for them are more likely to get on these programs. And so you don't necessarily address the population that you really intend to address with it. The universal basic income approach, I think it's something worth considering for a few reasons. In the Guyanese context, we are even considering this because of what the new petroleum sector affords us.
Yeah.
And anytime I speak on anything relating to petroleum, I have to be careful because I am one of those persons who have been critical about how we're approaching it. And some people interpret that to mean that you don't want a petroleum sector. So if I'm going to talk about how we use money from petroleum, that's something that needs to be clarified. We do know that petroleum is not the future. We do know that it is responsible for um, a lot of the environmental issues, and this stems from the burning of the petroleum fuels and whatnot. And so it means that we, while we engage in it, need to do so responsibly. And so my view is, from a pragmatic perspective, given that we have it and we're in it, we have to talk about how we go about it responsibly. What are the caps that we'll put on things, or is it something we're just going to allow to run away? Those are my views on it, and that's why that is not inconsistent with talking from a pragmatic perspective about what we do with the money we generate from the petroleum sector. The universal basic income, if we were to implement something like that in Guyana, it does uh, have the contextual issues, and I saw it pops up on the screen about extreme poverty. We haven't been so good at collecting and disseminating poverty data in the last 15 years or so. You'd be hard pressed to find something within the last 5 years, some new data within the last 5 years about poverty. But we know that there is a lot of problems with poverty. We also know that inequality is high. And what that means when politicians speak about these macroeconomic indicators, in my mind, it sort of narrows down to our talking about how much we did for the few elites in the country because it doesn't get distributed. And therefore, it means that uh, while government might be engaged in certain programs and promoting investments and so forth, that is not necessarily getting to the people in poverty. When we talk about using the natural resources, that belongs to everybody, not only us who are here now, but the next generations. And so we have a responsibility as it relates to not environmental, but intergenerational justice to make sure that whatever we do now, the benefits are not what we provide for ourselves now, but we do it in such a way that the next generations have nothing. And I say all of that to say that with a potential universal basic income program being linked to the petroleum, what we're getting from petroleum, in many countries, universal basic income would be resting on top of your tax system. And you get concerns about who is putting in and who should get out and what's not, and whether you give people something for nothing. Those concerns might exist even in a situation where you're generating income by the government and the country engaging in something like petroleum production. Those concerns may not go away, but I think that has to be considered. And so that might be one of the differences, though in other countries you may have it being linked to money generated in petroleum sector and other natural resources sectors as well. But that needs to be part of that, along with the poverty issue and inequality, needs to be part of what we think about. So, how do we ensure that what we're generating gets to everybody, given the context. And that's where I think the universal basic income thing becomes attractive in our context. It gives us the opportunity to make sure that everybody is targeted. And that deals with questions about why give money to who is already rich. Well, I would go back to the justice part of it, and say, simplify everything, everybody gets. But we have to be careful about at what level we pitch it, what the amount is, so that it can be sustainable. We have to think about what happens in the long term. We have to combine that with investments from petroleum funds to make sure that that is sustainable and we can keep it going. So I think all of that needs to happen in the background, so that we can have a program like that, targeting what we think it should target, but also having in mind that we must have intergenerational justice, because things can run out, and we need to be careful about that. Governments, when they engage in projects, they might frame them as development projects. A lot of governments like to put in place or like to engage in legacy projects, huge projects that they can point to say, we did this or that or the other. In our context, if you look at and you believe corruption perception as it is measured and produced on an annual basis, you realize that we have a lot of that. When they give projects, who they give projects to, who are the people aligned. And again, all of that speaks to who is really benefiting from the petroleum sector, given that it's money from the petroleum sector that might be primarily used for these projects. And so here again, from a context perspective on what goes on, the universal basic income is an attractive option. We look at our health system, who has access. We have a large and developing private health system, not so much development in the public system comparatively. Who has access to better health care? Who has access to better education? If you were to analyze that in the country and see who is going to the well-known and top schools, you'd realize that those who are already more privileged, well, I guess this is part of their privilege, to be able to access the best of these things. Not that anybody else can't access, but I think if you look on average overall, what is happening, that's where you will arrive at. A universal basic income approach allows people to do so much more. You see, when you're in poverty, and especially extreme poverty, you're trying to put one foot in front of the other, keep things going. You can get locked into a bad situation, but you know what? It's keeping things ticking over week by week or day by day. You don't have time to strategize and think about some big plan. You don't have time to initiate a project that might give you returns within 6 months. I can't pursue that because if I do that, I don't eat tomorrow. A universal basic income approach frees up people to do these kinds of things. And this moral concern about giving people something for nothing, I'd say this, you don't have to intend something for that thing to be achieved through what you say and do. Sometimes privilege is such that we don't consider that situations are different, circumstances are different for other people. And probably we can't because our worldview is what it is. That approach or that point of view really, as I think about it, seems to rely on the assumption that people in poverty are somehow inherently different from those who are not in poverty. And then ultimately, it means that those people must be responsible for their own situation. And that's why we believe if we give them some money, they're not going to work. If given some money or enough money, people are not going to work, how do we account for the super rich people who continue to generate more and more money? Is it that they're inherently different from poor people? Or is it that they're in different situations? And if having some amount of money being enough and you quit producing doesn't apply to these people, then you're ultimately saying that these people are different. I don't know how you escape that argument. And that is what causes, I think, people to believe that if you give poor people money, they're not going to want to work. Where's the evidence of that? I understand that it seems like a logical argument, but I also will admit that in anything you do, you'll have people who go against the rules, you have people outside of the norms, but that point of view is also subject to confirmation bias. It's a point of view that is not based on the facts. It's a point of view in search of facts to support it. And so every time you see a situation that seems to conform it, it reinforces what you believe, right? And so a bad decision by somebody in poverty is more worthy of chastisement than a bad decision by somebody who is wealthy. They make bad decisions all the time, but we don't see it in the same way as if somebody in poverty makes a bad decision. So my whole approach to this would be, how do we uh, create a situation where petroleum resources get to everybody because it belongs to everybody? And how do we also make sure that it's sustainable? And this is separate and apart from the things that we have to do to make sure we are addressing the whole petroleum sector in uh, a good way, if there is a good way to deal with the sector. And from that perspective, I think universal basic income in the Guyanese context would be very useful. I'll tell you a few more things, I believe. And some of these things were mentioned in some of the general benefits. We have a problem with people dropping out from school. They got to drop out from school to go earn a living. What if they don't have to think about that? They're freed up now to pursue education. So we have education level rising. People who don't generate the kind of income as it is are able to get better health care. I think what we need to be looking at, and I said this before, is well-being rather than the macroeconomic indicators in a context where inequality is such a problem. So how, and what we mean by well-being, it's about people feeling comfortable, healthy, happy, and so forth. And there are many things that go into measuring that. I believe a basic income scheme, such as we're talking about, will impact on people's well-being. And there's so many studies around the world that have been done on this. I looked through briefly, and you can see how it's impacting on people. Um, uh, the purchasing power. I mean, people have the money. Where do you think they're going to spend the money? It's within the economy. I don't know if that can have the effect of people raising prices on things, though. That's something to look at. They might feel people have money now, so we can raise prices. That's something to consider. And perhaps from the economists might have some views on that. Um, Empowerment is a major issue, especially for women, and I think this was mentioned. Um, in our society, men are usually the heads of households. Um, Women are more likely to take up the traditional roles of a homemaker, for example, or doing work for the family. And because they don't have the same kind of monthly income, I think they give up a lot of power to the person in the home that brings the money in. Now, if everybody has some amount of money that they can rely on, now women can take care of themselves. They have a stronger voice. Women don't feel like they need to stay in abusive relationships and that sort of thing. So there are many other social impacts that universal basic income scheme can have. But I will stop there and see if there is any redirect.
So actually, I was wondering. So this comment from Christopher Wilson, have there been any studies that you can point us that have been done precisely in Guyana around, identification of poor areas, mechanisms that are specifically aimed at reducing poverty? Are there some things sitting around at the University of Guyana that folks have done historically there in this regard? And then I wanted to ask you one more question around some of the work that you've been doing with this perception business. And so what is your sense of, is there enough trust in the sort of Guyanese polity for just the acceptance of the idea that a universal basic income could be useful, and then there's enough confidence in the political culture to be able to say that we would be confident enough to have them work out a mechanism for doing it.
So in terms of poverty studies, the overarching issue is that we have not been good at collecting poverty data, I would say, in the last 15 years, probably a bit longer. I've had on occasion to, you might be doing a report on something or the other, not necessarily academic writing. And one of the things you want to do is describe, or even in my academic engagement, you want to describe the Guyanese context. And when you start to get into that, you see you're citing literature from 2006, from the 1990s, 1980s. And so you don't have a lot of, especially recent work on it. And I think it's because the data are not really there. You have organizations that collect data. It might be survey type data, which you can do certain things with that. But I believe that we do need to get back to this thing of collecting data on poverty and making that available, or the findings of it available, so people can see. What flashed across the screen earlier about poverty potentially being at about 40%, I'm pretty certain
That's what I want to ask you. So how does the World Bank get that number? So that person,
I think they do some kind of modeling to predict where these things are.
yeah,
They might have some other means of collecting data, but that's at least has been my experience attempting to. For example, I did a study on poverty attributions in Guyana, and you want to describe the Guyanese context. And what I'm telling you is the kind of literature I was citing in an attempt to describe the context in Guyana. And this is as recent as last year. So there is that, and I think we need to tighten up on that, because we need to know, and if it's terrible, we really do need to know so that we can direct attention to it and resources to it. Trust, that's an interesting issue across the world. But in Guyana, and especially as it relates to anything with politicians involved, you're going to get issues with trust in our institutions is low, and it has to do with our institutions being weak and people seeing that current politicians, by that I don't mean those who are in power now necessarily, but whoever are the people in government at a particular time, they have such a heavy hand in and a pivotal role in how our institutions function, sometimes even on little day-to-day matters, that changes from one time to the next can be so drastic. You can have people getting bumped to the front of a line on something, people getting these public institutions, some people seem to have get preferential treatment. And those things have not been good for trust in our institutions. And so the administration of anything like this, having to deal with funding, will be an issue. And if we really want to have a program that is respected and believed to be run properly, we also have to think about the institutional mechanism that will be in place to administer it. Unless there is some drastic change in how we operate in our society, I don't know how well the current institutions will be trusted to administer something like this. I mean, we see it every day with awarding contracts, for example. You get all kinds of rumblings about that, and we have laws in place, we have procedures in place, you have procurement procedures in place. Still, you get so often issues arising. So that is trust is a concern, but I think in spite of that, that should not deter us, because what we must always consider, while all of that is going on, there are still people who are so poor, and their lives can be impacted so drastically, dramatically, so heavily by something like this. And not only for them in the current state, but for the next generation, because they will be able to do more with and for their children, for example, and ensure that they have better education, which should take care of them in the future. I don't know if that answers your question, but feel free to
Yeah, that's
get
certainly.
back to it.
I think what you're saying is, look, I mean, that there's a trust deficit, but the trust deficit should not deter us from having a serious consider. And so there's a question here from Quasi Fraser, and maybe I wanted to direct it to you, Mike. You know, how do you like? There's a plan, but let's say you are a technical guy. You show up and someone says, I want to design one of these things. What are the elements that you begin to look at in relation to Quasi's question around, how do you figure out how much money is needed to make an impactful reduction in the cost of healthcare, education, water, fuel? How does the economist sort of put this together at just a purely technical level?
So they often look at they try to measure, and this is very context dependent, right? But they try to measure sort of what people need to sort of be so-called self-sufficient in a certain context. So they really have to do a kind of survey of the cost of living, in a certain geographical area. So they will use or come up with price indexes, right? And they will try to gather a representative, I'll say a basket of goods that, like, the average person in that area, uses, right? So not the extremely rich person or the extremely poor person, but they want to get to sort of the median person, and what do they buy on average? And they will try to figure out, is there a way to create an index of what they buy? One example of this is the Consumer Price Index in the U.S., right? But some kind of index. But the index is trying to really represent, what is in this basket people purchase. And given that, what would be the income level they would need to purchase that, periodically, per month, per year, per biweekly or whatever. And then you may use that index for the average person or average family. But if we're looking at individual recipients and the average person in this context, and then you want to try to use that to sort of model the UBI. But the question is, can you get a UBI? Like, how high can the UBI get? Can you? It may not be, given how it's financed. Given the behavioral effects of how it's financed, given the effects of the UBI on people's behavior potentially, right? And I have some thoughts about that I would like to come back to. Based, is it Thomas, based on what Thomas said, right? But you try to sort of target the UBI as close as you can to this index that's trying to measure what the average person in this area needs to sustain themselves in that area, right? And so it's going to vary. For example, the U.S., even the U.S. as a whole, is going to vary from Guyana, I'm sure, right? But then parts of the U.S. are going to vary, So one problem with the UBI in the U.S. context is that if you give everybody the same UBI across the country, it's really going to vary in its impact on how well it helps them, because of Mississippi is not the same as New York as far as cost of living, right? So that's how they do it technically. But while I'm talking, can I comment on some of the things Thomas said earlier? So a few things. So one thing, I don't know. I assume maybe someone here. There are 80 people here, or something like that, 80 people. so someone here might be familiar with what I'm going to say. But as you were talking about the oil revenue or the oil industry and how might that work with a UBI, the only UBI in the U.S. I know of is Alaska. And Alaska's, and they don't call it a UBI there. Alaska's, I'll say its political culture is such that they might not want to think of what they do as a UBI. But given how I defined it earlier, it's a UBI, right? And what they do and what they've done since '82, I think, is there was a governor at the time who, I'm sure not just him, but he and others, I'm sure, came up with the idea, as Thomas said, that the oil in the ground in Alaska belongs to all Alaskans. It's not really just the oil companies. It's a natural resource that belongs to all Alaskans. And so the oil companies are given, the ability to profit from that, but they really owe a share of the profits to all Alaskans, right? So they call their UBI the permanent fund dividend, and they use the word dividend on purpose. I think the idea is they're Alaskans are shareholders, so they're all owed this dividend. And so what they did, there are details. Basically, what they did is they taxed the royalties of oil companies, invested the tax revenue in a portfolio, and then part of the returns are given to every Alaskan resident once a year. So that's the periodic part, so once a year, right? And that's a basic income. It's a UBI. It's not a large one. The period is not very frequent, but once a year is a periodic UBI. And so that might be a model for Guyana to think about. But as Thomas said, that does have its issues. Oil may not last forever. And also oil is a carbon, it's a greenhouse gas. That's an issue. And so a lot of people are critical of what Alaska does for that reason. But that may be a model to look at if you haven't already. I don't know, maybe people haven't looked at that in your context. But Alaska does exactly that. And it's very popular in Alaska, as I understand it. It's very popular across the political spectrum.
So have there been people who moved to Alaska based on the fact that they have this and take up residence? I don't think so, right?
I don't. From what I've heard, I don't think that's happened very much. I mean, for one thing, Alaska is really cold, so that's that's one disincentive from doing that. So I don't think like I wouldn't move there for that reason. Right? But I don't think there's been much evidence of that as far as I know. Right? But it's popular. Now what Alaska did is there was a deal. The deal was that if, as I understand it, if they did this, they would get rid of their. I think they had an income tax. I think they had one at that time, or they were considering one. But the deal was that we would do this, and there would be no income tax, right? So Alaska depends a lot on revenue from taxing royalties for its public sector. So that's something to think about. Do you want to have the whole public sector rely on this one source of revenue, because then that affects the UBI amount you could give out, right? So that's one thing Thomas mentioned that I thought about. Also, the something for nothing objection, right? People shouldn't give something for nothing. I agree with you. I agree with everything you said about that. I mean, and the way I get at the same points you made is sometimes when I hear that objection, I say well, if you really believe that, you should be opposed to inheritance. Because rich people they can leave their kids money, and the kids don't need to do anything to inherit that money. They can do nothing, right? Now some people might say, well, that's their money, they can do what they want with their money. But we can set tax policy to discourage inheritance. I mean, we can really tax those transfers a lot if we really believed that folks shouldn't get something for nothing, right? But maybe we should say you only get inheritance if you work for it, but we don't do that. And I suspect we don't do that in part because we think it's their money to do what they want to do with it. But also, to Thomas's point, I suspect that in the U.S. we don't do that because we don't think of rich people and their kids needing to be kind of urged to work by threatening them with starvation if they don't, right? We don't do that to them. And the last point I think that Thomas made about empowerment of women, that's precisely why a lot of UBI supporters think that a UBI should not be household based; it should be individual based. I mean, especially these supporters who think of themselves as feminist. They worry a lot about how a household benefit might be controlled by the male. And I think there's some evidence, as I understand it, across parts of the world where even for non-UBI policies, if benefits go directly to women, they tend to use it on the kids and family. I don't want to say bad things about men here. I am one, but whereas the males tend to do that less. I mean, that's what so that's one reason people say it should be individual. And I'll be quiet now. I talk too much. Right.
No, so it's amazing. You see, this is what I hope our conversation would begin to take a serious, sober look at and a proper look at this issue, and it's generated quite a bit. So I think I wanted to take this comment from another comment from Sid. So I think this is broadly, I think Kwesi said of aligned to our broad, or at least the broad theory is that providing Guyanese with some financial security that a UBI can foster in the best sense will generate the entrepreneurial activities, boost local businesses, support the investments in the non-oil sector such as agriculture and renewable energy and AI. And so I think this is the hope, and I think he's captured it. Kwesi Fraser's captured it very nicely. But the sort of counter hope is being reflected here. So Andre Brandach is sort of saying, look, I mean, low-income countries are best served by strategy focused mainly on attracting investment. Once they become lower middle-income countries, they need a more sophisticated approach. Investment supplemented by an infusion of technology from abroad. So maybe it gets to somehow John says just diversify your economy and invest in people, and maybe are we going to use? So I want you to sort of somehow put those three things together as a kind of last thought before we head out. I'm quite shocked. It's already 11:45. it's been going along so smoothly. Yeah. So, I think diversify your economy and invest in people. Investing in people, the UBI is an investment in people. And so, I don't know, make the argument for me once more so that I can share it with as many people as possible. Make the argument abstractly from the City University of New York, and then perhaps make the argument from the University of Guyana. I don't know which we'll give the University of Guyana the last word. So we'll go first with the City University of New York since we're further away.
Okay. So I would say that the idea of investing in Guyana, or just investing in, I think, low-income countries was the point. I think that often investment is sort of narrowly understood. You want to give money to already existing companies, maybe, to help them expand, or give money to people who are formulating business plans of some kind. And that's one kind of investment. But if you think of investment broadly, as Terrence was getting at, and I think someone else in one of the Beckman, from John, think of it more broadly. UBI can be seen as part of the kind of strategy. And there was another set of comments there where someone mentioned how UBI might spur entrepreneurial activity. So I think that if you think of those two slides along with the first one, I think UBI can be an investment in people to the extent that people use the money, and some, I suspect, will, to maybe even start businesses, or I mean, it would depend on how big the UBI is, but also I would guess that in a low income country, you would need a smaller UBI than you would in the U.S. to spur business innovation, things like that. I mean, I would guess in a low income country, because the costs would be low. I'm assuming costs would be low. So a smaller UBI might be more effective at doing some of the things UBI proponents say it could do in Guyana than in the U.S. Right? So I agree. I mean, a UBI is a kind of investment in people because people may use that to do some of the more traditional things people usually have in mind when they talk about investment, like business procurement, things like that.
Troy, Thomas, you get the last word, obviously.
Yes. So some of what was said in the comments might be outside of my expertise to speak authoritatively on, but I think the UBI is an investment in people. On the issue of diversifying the economy, we might have the point of view of who should drive the diversification. I suspect that in the view from, I think it's a World Bank report being cited, that seems to suggest that the government should drive the diversification of the economy. But I believe entrepreneurship can fill that gap, but people need to have time to engage in it. And people need to feel secure in engaging with it. The wheels are not going to fall off if I take 6 months or a year to develop something and get it to market, for example. And so people can drive the diversification of the economy through entrepreneurial engagement. And so if that qualifies, then that would seem to be in sync with what is said there, but it's a matter of who drives the diversification, who determines what to get into, or what areas to get into. Well, I think it can be achieved through the UBI approach. There was one thing there about attracting foreign investment, and that's the part I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak on the full range of impacts or consequences that might have, because I believe in the back of my mind, I think we're at the stage where we really need to develop local skills, local talents, local production. And that might be to some extent at odds with the foreign investment, but I can't ignore the fact that foreign investments have over time been good for countries. I suspect there is some kind of limit as well on it. So I don't look at it necessarily as one or the other. And so even while we talk about attracting foreign investment and so forth, I don't think that that affects whether or not you can focus on something like a UBI. And that's where I would leave that and say, the people with more expertise on that matter can address it. I think those were the points that I saw in the two things. So yes, I'll leave it there, considering that we are running up against the time now.
Yeah, gentle folks, I want to thank you. This has been this has gone far beyond, and now I think I've set the stage. And in a way, I was thinking that, you two have really set the stage now for me to listen to Professor Thomas's plan. So now I have a sense of what the full contours of the space would look like, in a way to better think about the plan. And so hopefully, in the near future, I will be able to re-engage that aspect of content. But I do want to thank you. I mean, the definition is clear for me now. It's something that's periodic. It's something that is cash. It's something that's targeted at individuals, and precisely individuals, and not at households. And it is something that is unconditional and universal. And so broadly, everyone gets this. And it really functions as the cash, in a sense, functions as more kind of income assistance, driving the average income side of the ball up. And really, the mathematical question is, how to optimize what the UBI level should be. Given all of the variables, what's the optimal sort of level that achieves the kinds of things that you've discussed? So you gave a really nice question, which perhaps should be the question that I started with. How do we create a situation where petroleum resources get to everyone? And I think we now have this model from Alaska, which in some sense has created a UBI where not monthly, not quarterly, but at least yearly, there is some sense of the benefits of the petroleum patrimony being distributed in some real patrimony. And perhaps I'll come back to that at some point. But I also want points that you made around healthcare, around education, and ways in which a UBI can increase. I mean, I'm thinking about the Guyana context now, looking through the recent discussions in Guyana around math literacy, and seeing that so many students have not done well in math, and the implications for that going forward in a broadly STEM-based society, and seeing that really in the inequality gap is wide because of the access to education, and the access to quality education. One would hope that at the core end of the spectrum, having some extra resources to invest in your children's education and lessons, etc., would be something that could be afforded by a UBI. So, I want to again just thank you. This is really kind of enriched my understanding, and I trust that it's enriched the understanding of the folks who have listened here today. Certainly by way of the comments. It's for many of them that indicate that. I was just about to share one more. Ryan Moore is a tricky thing in a small economy where there's one industry, and I think that's also one of the issues that has motivated me. I mean, the very first time I understood the nature of an FBSO, this is something that will at max 600 jobs. And so you can't really depend on this offshore oil and gas thing for mass employment. And so the thing is, okay, you want to build the infrastructure, you want to do all of these things, but how long will it take for the benefits to be shared and felt by the people? And so as that window sort of widens, what you get is sort of what we're seeing in some of the things, a sort of sharp kind of vitriolic discourse around who has and who hasn't. And so it's good for us to have considered this. Finally, thank you to all of the participants, the engagement, thoughtful questions. It's been really dynamic, and I do appreciate the time and the commitment to sort of exploring, and I hope we can continue to do it again in the not too distant future. So thank you, folks, and I'll hit the end stream. Yeah, it was quite good, actually.